Hey there, Jenny from Waxwing Sewing Studio, putting together one last quick video for the Madden, just to help you make sure that you're on the right track when you're about to install the waistband. So the waistband is a little bit, it can be a little bit tricky because it's asymmetrical. We're dealing with asymmetrical pieces here. So what I have in front of me is what your waistband should look like once it's constructed. So what I've got, here's my front, and I'm looking at my front facing. And I know that because my front facing is the one that I picked randomly because the two fronts are the same. My front facing is the one that I have turned down by 1/4 inch all the way across. So you can see that. That's the first thing you want to check that you've done. The second thing you want to check that you've done is when you've sewn this together, you have both sides finished. That's because you sewed up at 1/2 inch and then over at 1/4 inch and then down the other side at 1/2 inch. And then you trimmed these corners to make them, nice and straight, or give them like more room to be pointed. And then you flipped this over, made sure it looked nice. And then to get this understitching line, what you did is you started your sewing machine just as close as you could get to the end here. You can see my line starting, a couple inches from the end. And then you sewed like a top stitching line just to get that seam down on the facing side. And what that's going to do is it's just going to have a nice clean finish, that doesn't wobble around too much on your waistband. It'll just feel more secure. So the other thing to check is that your facing side, is going to be the back. So over here, I'm looking at my pleated skirt, and I've got my front. I can tell because I've got this nice big pleat with no seam in the front. I have my side seam, which has my pocket, and then I have my back over here, and it's right side up looking at me. I want to make sure that my facing side is going to be the back of this thing. It's going to be tucked in like this when it's done. And my right side of my waistband lines up with the seam here. So when you've done all those things, you've checked and made sure that you've got your waistband arranged correctly so you can go ahead and install it on the skirt. Once you've done this, installing it on the skirt is pretty straightforward. You want to start by finding all your notches. So I have a center front notch here on my waistband, and I can see my center front notch here. I'm going to grab my quilting clips, which I like for thicker seams. You can use pins too, though. It doesn't matter really. I'm going to find my notch here. I'm going to line up my seams right here. I'm going to line up my end over here. And then you just make sure that it's going to fall into place correctly. Put a couple more pins in it. You want to sew it with the waistband looking at you so this doesn't get in the way. And then just carefully sew over your pleats, which you've stay stitched at 1/4 inch so you're not, messing with them as you sew. They should just sew on nice and cleanly. This is over a curve, right? This is going over your hip curve, so there's a little bit of ease through this part to get it all nicely lined up. So playing with that a little bit. Looks good. And then on the back side, do the same thing. Find my notches. I have one at the seam for the center back. And one I'll put at the end here. You get these ends like totally straight and nicely lined up because that's going to be a really showy part of your finished skirt. So get that nicely pinned there. And then go and pin. Pin this nicely in place. And when I go, once I finish, get one more pin in here. Notice I'm kind of letting everything be, do what it's doing. Arrange it. Make sure my grain line is looking nice and straight on my pleats. And then the only other trick I wanted to share before you go over to your machine is that this waistband is sewn on at 1/4 inch, not a 1/2 inch. You've been doing most of your construction seams at a 1/2 inch. So make sure that you do this at 1/4 inch. I actually did it the first time at 1/2 inch because I wasn't reading the instructions carefully. I wanted to make sure that you didn't do that because tearing out a seam along those pleats takes a little bit of time. Once you sew that, you're going to be able to flip it over and you're going to catch your finished or your neatened seam over here. It's going to go right over your seam allowance, and then from the front, you're going to stitch in the ditch with your stitch in the ditch foot, which I'll show you how to do over at the sewing machine. All right, so I've just gone over to my sewing machine and I've sewed the front part of the face of the waistband onto the skirt at 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then I went over to my iron and I pressed up that seam allowance into the waistband. So, and I also made sure that all my pleats were a little bit pressed at the top, so they were going to be nice and straight. So I've got my waistband on here, and the last step for installation is going to be to get this back waistband facing stitched down so it will stay put. So the first thing you want to do is check to make sure that your waistband facing is going to cover your seam allowance all the way across your skirt. And then at the end, I put little quilting clips at the very end here to kind of press down the seam allowance at the end here, but you'll want to press in your seam allowance so you don't have any messy bit there, and make sure that you're happy with how this part looks on the other side. So I'm happy with that. Could it be like a tiny bit straighter? Yeah, but it doesn't matter in the scheme of things. I don't think so. But you can always go back and, try to get it even a little bit more perfect if you wanted. And on this side's looking really good. So, and I have it tucked in like that. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a stitch in the ditch foot, or really any foot you have will do it. But if you have a stitch in the ditch foot, that's really helpful. And we're going to stitch right in what we call the ditch here, right where the seam is. And the goal is to pick up the seam allowance on this side and get an edge stitch along here. So to help us do that, we're going to flip our skirt over to the right side. Now that's all nicely pressed. And then we're going to grab our pins and we're going to pin right along the seam line here. You see I'm going to be sewing from this direction, so I'm going to pin with the pointy part, that allows me to pull out the pin as I sew. You can see I have little basting stitches popping out here and there. I can go back and rip those out if I want to after I do this. I probably won't though, because I don't think anybody's ever going to notice. But I'm using my fingers to just make sure I'm catching the very back of this facing. And I'll just put a few more pins in. Don't do a ton of pins because you're going to feel with your finger as you go. Make sure that your facing's in the right spot. So pin, pin, pin. Okay. So in the back, I'm looking nicely aligned and in good shape. So I'm going to go over to my machine and we're going to get this sewn. All right, I'm over at my machine and we've just pinned our waistband facing to our front waistband. We're about to stitch in the ditch. I've switched my foot to a foot that has a guide right at the center point of my foot. Sometimes it's called a stitch in the ditch foot. This is actually a quilting foot, super useful to have around. You might have a foot in your stash that looks more like this. This is a great foot to use for this as well, just as good, does the same basic thing. Or, I use my walking foot for most of my construction seams. And if you only have a walking foot, or even if you just have your standard issue foot, you just need to make sure that you're guiding your needle, right through the center here. So that's, this extra guide just makes it a little easier. So I'm lining up at my machine here. All right, and I'm dropping my needle, and I'm making sure that my length of my needle, I usually put it up just a little bit, tiny bit more than for standard construction stitch. I have it at a 2.6 right now. Make sure my thread is back behind my thing so we don't get a big thread nest right at the edge here. Try to get perpendicular with the edge of my waistband to my skirt right here. And then I'm going to take one stitch forward and then take a couple stitches back to the very edge. And then I'm established and I can get started. So I'm going to use my fingernail and my tip of my finger to really feel, to make sure that I can feel the facing edge right here so that I'm not missing it, because then we'd have to do it again if we missed it. So I'm moving forward slowly, making sure that my grain line stays kind of nice and straight here. I'm not warping anything as I go through. And then making sure that as I go over each pleat that the edge guide doesn't catch the pleat. Okay, making sure I still have an edge here. Pull my pin. So go around the hip, make sure I've got the right kind of curve happening here. As I get to the edge here, just make sure, remember, this is going to be a curved waistband. So you want to kind of hold the linen where it's going to be on the body. So you're sewing the right part of the waistband, the right part of the skirt. And at the end here, I'm going to like triple check to make sure you're going to catch that facing, especially at the very edge. All the way to the edge. Back stitch. And tie off. And I missed the very edge. I could just go in and blind stitch this, like hand sew it. That's if you want to be super careful on the front. But you can also just now, if you miss right at that edge there, which is really easy to do, I'm gonna put my foot back in. I'm gonna move my needle. Oh, right, I can't do that on this one. I'm just gonna try to really like catch the very get it tacked down just enough. And it looks like the rest of this I've caught my edge here. So I now have an installed skirt. So last step is just to get your buttonholes on. You can tie off, get rid of your little thread bits there. Your buttonhole on the waistband is going to go horizontal, and then the rest of your buttonholes are going to go vertical. And remember, you have a buttonhole guide in your Madden pattern kit. There's a piece for that. Good luck with finishing up your project, and congrats for getting this far.